James Phelan about the affordances of feminist narratology.
Okay, well, it's a real pleasure and honor, and I feel the same way as the other panelists, to talk about Robyn, my friend, my collaborator, my former department chair, my colleague in Project Narrative, and so many things. And so I had so many sort of ways to talk about Robyn and how important I think she is and her work is. And I've decided to do a talk really about her work primarily and her lifetime work in terms of a Lifetime Achievement Award. So let me get started. It seems to me that we can, maybe a little bit reductively, but still not entirely unfairly, identify three consistent principles in Robyn's feminist narratology. She's always talking about form and politics and history. And she sees those things as not discrete, but as integral, right? And when she started, the concept of form she was working with was classical narratology's conception, and that's evolved over time. And then the politics, as Sue was saying, right, that the politics in that intersection immediately changed the concept of form. And so early in the 80s, when feminism was focused primarily on gender, and gender was the sort of dominant thing, but over time that shifted as, you know, the work becomes more about intersectional identity and also then cultural power. And then for Robyn, then that results in form and politics coming together in terms of the effects of narrative. And I've described that as how narrative works on audiences and why that work matters. And then the history, right? So form and politics are always situated in Robyn's work. And so when we think about contextualist narratology, we think about feminist narratology as contextualist narratology. I think we think about Robyn's feminist narratology. So then what I'm going to do today, working with those principles, is to do a kind of meta commentary. Right. So what would it be like to read Robyn's own work through the lens of her feminist narratology? So in other words, what are the salient forms, politics, and historical context of Robyn's projects? That in itself is a question that, you know, I could stand up here for hours, right? But nobody wants that. But over 30 plus years of work, right, we have this really impressive quantity, range, diversity, everything from the Victorian novel, Victorian culture, to television, focalization, to seriality. Robyn's done edited collections and anthologies. She's working on this wonderful website about reading like a Victorian. What I'm going to do then is focus just on three moments across the 33 years. So the first is gendered interventions. The second is having a good cry. And the third is a revelation, something only I'm, I think, in the position to know, unless Robyn's shared this more widely, a current project and an essay called Structures of Everyday Racism in the Stories of 8 African-American Women. So in the sense, so these three moments, we go to 1989 with gendered interventions. Maybe I can quickly summarize the work of form, politics, and culture in the book because it's more familiar. Sue and Helena have already talked about it. But basically, just to remind you, she's focused at the level of form on an aspect of discourse. What is direct address to the narratee and extradiegetic, heterodiegetic narration in 19th century fiction concerned with reform. And Robyn ends up tracing patterns in this address along a spectrum from engaging and distancing. So then at the level of politics, that then Robyn connects that to gender. Right? Women are more likely to use engaging strategies, men are more likely to use distancing strategies. Then that builds to the idea that, okay, this is connected to larger forms. So metafiction, the male mode, predominantly male mode, is connected to distancing narrator-narratee relationships, whereas the engaging ones go more with realism. The other thing is that Robyn is extending the work of structuralist narratology in a way by going from the narratee, talking about narratee actual audience relationships and how that works. And then at the level of history, she's making claims about her corpus and not about all narrator-narratee relationships. Okay, so what would we like to turn Robyn's lens on gendered interventions? So at the level of form, things that stand out, voice, clarity. Helen has talked about that to some degree. I won't go into detail, but also then to say theory practice, that what's going on here is this two-way traffic between narrative theory and interpretation or sort of, giving us illumination of particular text. I think there's a political dimension to the project too, in the sense that Robyn is taking up a disparaged technique at the time and sort of saying, no, let's pay attention to this, right? And then obviously the politics that Sue's already talked about, bringing together narratology and feminism. I think there's this political dimension to that, right? So sort of run the risk of incurring the wrath of scholars in both camps, right? But to stand up and say, no, this matters, right? And then also to be talking about actual audiences as she does. Now here I want to just pause for a little bit and talk about the importance of gendered interventions and Sue Lander's work very much also beginning in 1986 for us, for the whole history of our field, right? I'm going to make a big claim here, and it probably would need to be qualified and so on. But my big claim is that if it weren't for Robyn and Sue, we wouldn't be here. That feminist narratology saved narrative theory. It certainly did in the United States, right? I would say that, right? It saved narrative theory for critical projects. Because without feminist narratology, I think narrative theory would have the same place in our current conversations as structuralism does. So, moment two, having a good cry. So here, Robyn's interest in form is about popular narrative forms as technologies of affect and technologies of gender. One of the political that's connected to the politics, one of the moves that Robyn makes is to try to reclaim the term effeminate as an honorific term to refer positively to gender traits of persons who don't meet masculine norms, right? And her notion of a good cry, right, is positive, right? It's not something to be embarrassed about or apologize for and so on. And she talks about why, that matters. And then in history, right? So Robyn's suggesting that the socio-cultural construction of masculine, feminine, and effeminate varies over time, and so do the forms and effects of technologies of gender. So, and then, as we said, Robyn has this terrific concern with emotions, the body, and gender. I'll just quote Robyn there. Emotion is there in the body, structured perhaps by the kinds of cultural forms I'm describing, but impervious to rational control or intervention. And this is sort of the practice side of theory practice, where the, dwelling in the experience of reading and being responding to forms leads to this insight, and then to say, but that doesn't mean we're powerless. We can think about what we feel. So we think about this from a feminist narratological reading of it, right? So again, we have similar things at the level of form. Also, I think there's something striking about Robyn's preface, which is entitled 6 Readers Reading and Feeling. And what she does in that preface is she moves from concrete experience to close reading of narrative structure and then to theoretical conclusions. And this is very much this kind of bottom-up way into the whole project, right? At the level of politics, I think there's multiple things going on. Robyn is saying, well, let's make popular culture this study of, our corpus here. And she's going to talk about formulaic narrative patterns, things that would be, oh, let's dismiss that, right? She also is going to say, and then that quote, right, affect needs to, so we're not going to apologize for affect. We're going to say, we're not going to sort of rule out certain kinds of affect as politically incorrect or anything like that. She's going to privilege that. And then Robyn will also talk about her own personal experience. And I think there's a political dimension to that, as feminism taught us that the personal is the political. Now here, I think in terms of the history of narratology, what's really important is that Robyn is part of the affective turn, bringing the affective turn into narratology. It's moving away from psychoanalysis, as Sue said, opening up corporeal narratology, what others have done here, like Dan Punde. And I think there's a way in which, with this book, Robyn's in some ways ahead of the game. Now we have this 4E approach to narrative, and Robyn was sort of doing it and having a good cry. Okay, so let me talk about the last one, Structures of Everyday Racism. A little bit of context here. It's part of an ongoing project on African-American women and everyday racism, which involves a team of researchers. So Lisa Sunshine is also involved, our colleague at Ohio State, Simone Drake, and I. And the question is, how can narrative theory illuminate women's oral narratives about everyday racism and point to possible remedies for it? So what we have are collected stories from 8 African-American women. I want to name them. Rhonda Henry Anthony, Scotia Brown, Mary Bullock, Mary Caraway, Destiny Faison, Felicia Henney, Lucretia Hatfield, and Latoya Hill Tahiru. So what we gave them a prompt, tell 2 stories about your experience with racism, one in which you achieved a successful outcome, and one in which you did not. We gave them some advice about composing the stories, and then we got 16 revealing oral narratives, and we think told very thoughtfully with considerable feeling. So then each of us adapts the central question, how can my analysis illuminate these narratives and point to possible remedies? So with Robyn's essay, I see it as a work of applied feminist narratology. And the big picture argument is that these women's stories are stories about not being heard. And then there are variations in each story about what not being heard means. And then Robyn makes this meta move, right? And I'll quote, I take our assignment in this project to be listening to the 8 women's stories of racist experience, carefully hearing what they say and taking seriously what they mean. So they've not been heard, and that's what comes through in the experience. What Robyn wants to do as analyst is hear them. So again, we have the 3 principles, focusing on the elements of narrative structure, the politics, linking the effects of the structures to racism and history. I won't go into all the details there because you haven't read it and my time is running short. But I do want to get to the way in which, my version of a rabbinical lens on it. So again, here I would stress, we have this consistent things about Robyn's great voice, the clarity. There's a kind of efficiency in it, which I'll get to in the next point. And it's the form is applied feminist narratology. So in the politics, one of the aspects of the politics of this Robyn's essay, I think, is that she chose, she's the only one of us so far, to talk about all 8 women's stories and feature them, right? Not sort of say, all right, I'm going to look at this one primarily, right? And I think that is itself a political move in the essay, and obviously the meta move of listening. So I would say that in terms of the history of narratology, in 2022, the essay sort of exemplifies for me the importance of applied narratology, and Robyn chose applied feminist narratology, of expanding the corpus. What are we working on? These stories of these everyday women, and of obviously addressing narrative and race. So I'll just wind up with a couple of quotes from Robyn and one more slide. So Robyn says in the essay, narrative analysis can't bring about material changes in the world. It can, however, produce insights that could motivate action. And the refusal to listen that we see in this, repeated again and again in the women's stories, is underwritten by layers of institutional practice. If every healthcare worker, every teacher, every law enforcement officer could learn to hear what an African American is saying and to understand what that person means within the historical context of racially discriminatory institutions, racism would begin to lose its power. So with Robyn, I think what we see is an approach to narrative as a way of knowing and doing, and offering a particular angle on that through feminist narratology and its intersecting three parts. And finally, I'll just say feminist narratology, especially as practiced by Robyn, contributes to the project of making the world a better place. And that's one more reason why we should be honoring Robyn. So thank you so much.